Welcome to Milestones. I'm Mike Johnson, and joining me today is co-host Dr. Dwayne Neal, OBE. Milestones is the podcast that has been reviewing the significant contributions made in the UK Black community since 1948. In this series, Series 2, The Windrush Nation, we're taking an inclusive approach by expanding the list of contributors to include people whose heritage is from the Caribbean, Africa, and Black British individuals with a dual heritage.
Okay, Mike, thank you for that introduction, and it's a pleasure, as always, to be working with you. Milestone Series 2 is very close to my heart because we're talking about our community, and we're showing all of those wonderful contributors from the three main channels that we have. And we're very fortunate to have Rob Neal with us as as the guest contributor for this episode. Rob, why don't you briefly introduce yourself, my friend?
Oh, well, thank you very much. And thank you to Life UK. Thanks for having me. It's wonderful to be here. My name's Rob Neal. I'm the son of Jamaican parents. My dad arriving in 58, my mum shortly after in 62. And I was born in Paddington. After my birth, I grew up in northwest London. And whilst there was a short spell, literally for 365 days, 1 year, straddling a calendar year, with my wife, we lived in Milton Keynes. I've spent all of my lived life in and around London directly. I'm a former civil servant where I worked amongst many a politician, serving most of my 38 years at the Ministry of Justice. I let go of my beloved civil service 3 years ago working at the Department for Education. I now run my own consultancy. We're called Crystal Alliance. That's Crystal with a K, if anyone of our listeners want to look us up, crystalalliance.co.uk. Have a little splash around there. And predominantly working with members and organisations across all sectors, public, private and voluntary or charitable, around equality, diversity and inclusion. And it's a real labour of love.
Okay, thanks.
Lovely.
Rob. You mentioned Milton Keynes. I've got to pick you up there because that's where I am. So
okay.
Whereabouts in Milton Keynes were you?
Wonderful, Mike. A wonderful bit of coincidence there. We lived in on a road called Westwood Close, number 43 it was, end of terrace, built from new, but in a place called Great Home.
Okay, yes. Because London...
We measured it, Mike, as 9 roundabouts in off the M1.
That's how I used to give my instructions to visitors.
Yes.
Fourth roundabout, do a left.
That's right. Exactly that. But the 9 roundabouts would take us through the edge of the point, the actual centre, and on about 3 roundabouts on. A lovely place called Great Home. It was before we had our children. We have a daughter and a son. And it was us trying to live somewhere else and exercising some form of social mobility, I guess.
And you were only 40 minutes away from central London on the train.
On a good day, Mike. Yes, on a good day. Notwithstanding HS2 connections or not.
Lovely. So if we could dive into the episode, we are actually going to be talking about politics from the standpoint of contributions by people from our community, our Windrush Nation. And we're going to kick off our conversation by talking about Baroness Patricia Scotland, by talking about the MP Kwasi Kwarteng, and talking about the former MP Chuka Umunna. And in the time-old principle of ladies first, gentlemen, should we start by talking about Patricia Scotland?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Well, in the research that we did in prep for this episode, we basically discovered an amazing lady And perhaps we shouldn't have been surprised because, she's risen to the level of the House of Lords, hence the Baroness. But, the three magic words that I've got at the front of my mind about her are diplomat, barrister, and politician. Diplomat, barrister, and politician. And of course, folks who've been tracking her career will know that she's in her second term as Secretary General of the Commonwealth of Nations. So let me pause it there and invite my colleagues to chip in.
Well, first thing I want to say about Baroness Scotland, I was impressed with her at the funeral of the Queen when she read the scripture reading. I thought, whoa, yes, I would want to listen to that. That was excellent. And that's just stood out straight away. She did a video for us when we celebrated the 75th anniversary of Windrush at the Brixton Church.
She did.
And that went down very well. So, yeah, she combined all her roles to do a marvelous job there for us.
Well, I want to chip in because it's strange how these things work out, because coincidentally, and you're right, Dwayne, with the channels, I think you described them as that we could have chosen and the people we could have chosen from those channels. I happen to have worked with all three. I've worked with all three of these individuals. I've worked with Patricia, I've worked with Kwasi, and I've worked with Chuka. And as we're talking about Baroness Patricia Scotland, the first woman Attorney General, the first black woman Attorney General at that. She was actually the first black woman QC back in 91.
Absolutely.
Council. And she was the first black minister, though not elected, but the first black minister when she became a minister at the Lord Chancellor's Department, which is where I worked with her. I remember once I shared a car journey with her, and it was a wonderful occasion. It wasn't planned. It happened to be that I was able to go in the car as we travelled from London to Birmingham. And the journey was just over 2 hours. And in that time, she shared some absolute pearls of wisdom with me that shall remain in the conversation between she and I. But she, at a point around about halfway through my career, she was able to pour into that and give me some sage advice. I remember very much we shared, at the time, she was assistant to the Queen's Counsel. And so we shared many a story about what it was she felt would be useful to deliver on some of the projects I was working on, and chiefly around delivery on racial equity at the time with the Black Staff Network. She was the absolute powerhouse. You're right, Dwayne, diplomat for sure, the Baroness that she is, and obviously the work that she does. But I remember, and what I can share in this offering is her absolute commitment to delivery and making sure that you followed through on what it is you'd say you'd do. And she was very much a doer. She wasn't concerned about who knew her or what reputation may have moved ahead of her. She was about getting things done. And if you look at her performances today, she's very much attached to the campaign about violence against women. She's a powerful advocate around that. She believes very much in social capital. She talks about wanting to put the wealth back into the common in her current role, as you say, Dwayne, now into her 5th year there. And she's a wonderful advocate around what we have in common as people across all ethnicities. She's a real believer in what Mayor Angelou talks about, that we have far more in common than we are different. And that she talks about, so she leans on the DNA of it all and says we've got, 98.9% of us is identical. And the bit that's different is the rich diversity that we can add spice to each other's lives. And she spoke to me about that personally as part of that journey. A wonderful role model, a wonderful servant for the UK government, and someone that I have worked with in 2 different guises. And I don't know if you know this, Dwayne, but she was one of the speakers at the original launch of the REACH programme before Reach Society. Yeah, she was one of the keynote
I
speakers
didn't
there.
know that, but it doesn't surprise me,
Yeah.
given the nature of her background and
Yeah.
her, priorities. Mike, did you want to come in there before I broaden the
Yes, I was going
conversation
to ask
around her?
Rob, knowing what you know about her, the many
Yeah.
firsts that she has in her life,
Yeah.
how did that make her? Did she seem, a humble, down-to-earth person, or
Mhm.
from what you're saying, I think it was that. Yeah, she still was level-headed, humble, and willing to pour into other people rather than letting all those things.
Well, without question, yeah, absolutely, Mike. I mean, she born in Dominica, of course, but she grew up in Walthamstow.
Mm.
What she had more than anything else, she never campaigned to be the first at anything. She never. That was not her aspiration. She just wanted to do a good job. Her talent did the rest. The fact that she was chosen for Attorney General by the then Labour Party's appointment, the fact that she was trustee and at times patron. She was one of the trustees at Reality, which stands for Raising Everyone's Awareness of Lives Lost in the Youth. That was homed in Walthamstow, but she was approached by the then director at Reality and founder Leroy Logan, who many of our listeners may have heard of, out of the Black Police Association. And that union gave rise to that appointment for herself as trustee. And she was so committed to it in a very quiet way, Mike, in answer to your question. Hardly anybody knew. She was never looking for a stage, or there was no fanfare. It was about what she could do to help with that cause. And that came shining through. I remember one time we had a lunchtime meeting across the lunch period of those that were running the Black Staff Network. And she had literally herself, very unusual for someone in her position, wandered into the cafeteria to catch herself something to eat. And she saw us on the table and she walked over and she said to us, how's it all going? How's the network going? I said, well, we're working hard. We're putting in the hours. And she said, I've got one bit of advice for you. And she asked for a napkin and she took out a pen, a rather fancy pen, and she wrote, I didn't know what she'd written down, but she wrote on a napkin. She said, don't look at this until you've finished your meeting. And so she gave me the napkin and folded it. Something was written on the napkin and she left the cafeteria. I kept to the promise. We waited until the end of the meeting. We made our way back up. I think we were working on the 5th floor. I took out the napkin, and on that napkin, she had written one word and then signed it. And that one word was delivery. And that was nearly 22, 23 years ago. And I've kept the napkin.
Wow.
I acetated it and kept it. And that has kept me going through my career day after day after day.
A wonderful example of people who make a difference because they understand. Of course, you need to talk about things and understand them. But if you don't perform the action part of whatever you're talking about, if you don't deliver, invariably you make little or no difference whatsoever. She started effectively from the same place that all of us did. There was no silver spoon, but there was ambition within the family. She went to the local school. She went on to read for a good degree in law. She went on to become, a professional and was called to the bar. And as you say, Rob, she has continued to deliver. And by virtue of her consistent delivery, she was invited to various situations. And I would like to think many of the viewers will remember that about her example, because once you start getting that and you look around our community, you can see those who are making a difference because they understand delivery matters. Gentlemen, we have two other folks that we would like to feature. And having had that wonderful discussion around Patricia Scotland, let me ask us to consider Kwasi Kwarteng. And of course, he will be fresh in all our minds for reasons I'm sure we will touch on. But what struck me in looking at the research about this young man of Ghanaian parents and born in London is just how bright he was from the get-go. You know, Eton educated, Trinity College, Cambridge educated, worked in a number of areas, but even before he did that, he went on to get himself a PhD in economic history at Cambridge. So that clearly is a powerhouse. And we will talk about the other things he's done before we talk about his political career and perhaps his faux pas. But he's also a publisher of several books. So we are talking about a gentleman of Ghanaian background who is no intellectual lightweight. No. He's a heavyweight. Let me pause it there.
Well, you've chosen the apt words there, Dwayne. Absolutely a heavyweight. As you say, an author, and I happen to have read perhaps his most well-known book, Ghosts of Empire, which he wrote when he was but 37 years old. This is a man who's not yet 50, Dwayne. He's not yet 50.
1977, 75 born. Absolutely.
Exactly. 26th of May. And born in London. I think always interested in politics from the earliest age. Initially a commentator on politics rather than someone who was actively engaged with it, but nonetheless more insightful because of that. I mentioned at the top of the show that I've worked with all three of our guests under the spotlight. Kwaze's who I've least worked with. I've worked with him on 2 conferences and one of them chaired the discussion in that exchange. But in the way it works within the civil service, certainly back then, I'm 3 years out the swim now, so I can't be certain of some of the protocol, but certainly back then, there were all series of briefings, pre-meets, and indeed a synchronicity that was reached for in terms of how you then present, a bit like how you might be preparing for some of your shows, Mike. And so it was fascinating to get an insight into that powerhouse of a mind, Dwayne. And you can't help sometimes but compare with other secretaries of state. And when you look at some of his achievements, which were edging towards some of them notable, some of them perhaps he might want to forget, but he still goes down in the record books and perhaps a milestone he'd want to let go of as being the shortest serving Chancellor of the Exchequer. I say shortest serving. There was Ian MacLeod back in the 70s who reigned for 7 days less, but actually died in office of a heart attack. Kwaze was sacked after 38 days because of the impact and some of the fallout with his partnership with Liz Truss in some of the decisions made. But going back to his book, Dwayne, Ghosts of Empire, I don't know if you've read it. Have either of you read that one?
No.
Okay.
I've certainly not read it, but I get the impression it would be a good read because clearly he was a guy who's incredibly knowledgeable.
Well, if my review counts for anything, but let me declare his politics are as far from my own as is possible, but it's a cracking read. Why? Because in it he coins a wonderful phrase called anarchic individualism. And what this book does, Dwayne, which I think will tickle you, knowing the historian in you, is he brings center stage 6 of Britain's former colonies: Iraq, Kashmir, Burma, Sudan, Hong Kong, and Nigeria. And he not only puts them under the microscope, Mike, he dissects them to reveal that far from the thought that some folk have about British Empire being this coordinated, highly efficient, grip on the world, and you know where it's going, Dwayne, don't you? We've got this kind of ego-driven, power-hungry phases and era of leadership, and he refers to it as anarchic individualism. And he breaks it down in such a way, and I think this is one of his more credible milestones. I say that with bias in play. I think what Kwaze gave certainly the Conservative Party was an insight from someone who whose heritage had come from somewhere else, but was telling them about themselves, if you know what I mean. Mm-hmm. And I think he did it in such an engaging way. I not only recommend the book, but it gave me an additional lens on which I could communicate with Kwasi, because as I say, and as I declare, his politics are about as far removed from my own personal politics as they could be. But as a trained civil servant working under the Nolan principles, I know not to have that come out in my work. And I'd like to think for all of my time in the civil service, I remain professional. I'm just a bit freer now, and I can say a bit more than I used to.
Sure. Mike, any thoughts from your side on Kwasi?
Well, he came came to my attention. I was watching him during the election campaigning for the leadership, when he supported Truss and so on. And it's amazing how it unfolded when she was under pressure and she asked, did you support, was this your idea, this budget, these tax cuts? No, it was the Chancellor's. I thought, ooh.
Yeah, bus and under come to mind.
Oh, absolutely. Curb as well.
Mike, wasn't it? I got, my hairs went up. I couldn't believe it was like theatre, wasn't it?
Yeah, it
was incredible.
He's dead. Soon as she said that, I thought, that's it.
Anarchic individualism.
There you go.
Well,
there you go.
You know, he will take a while to live down that fracas that took place with him and Liz. But I'd like to think, given the intellectual capacity and breadth of this man, the time will actually smooth over that error of judgment in backing her and give him another chance to show what he's got to offer. Because you made the point earlier, Rob, that, from a different background, and he was basically showing the British who they were through his erudition, his education, his learning. But, through the research, I don't see Kwasi as an outsider in that sense. He may have Ghanaian parents, but he was born here. He was educated here from start right through to his PhD. So he will have learned everything through the education system and his wider reading about our empire, about our way of doing things. And from that standpoint, I think he was just basically reflecting as a smart individual, entirely of this culture, entirely of this country, how we did it and how chaotic it was, and why perhaps it had all of those fault lines. And so from that standpoint, I see him very much as one of us. And why do I say one of us? A little bit like you, Rob. I was 8 when I joined my parents in the UK, and I'm a young man of 68. So I would claim 60 years of getting to know this country I've lived in. And, with Kwasi, he's lived his whole life in this country, and he's learned what this country is about from birth. And so from that standpoint, I just think he has more to offer. And who knows, even if he doesn't bounce back in the political environment, he may well find his way into some other sector, because he was a JP Morgan man for a time, and he wrote for the Telegraph and a number of other publications. The Guardian may surprise you, but he even wrote for them at one stage. So,
I just wanted to ask a question, though. When people in the Windrush Nation do things, become firsts or what have you, it fills us with a sense of pride. Do you think?
Absolutely.
Do you think the fact that he reigned for such a short period has an adverse effect? Do we feel differently about him, or has he brought some sort of disrepute on ourselves? I don't know. I'm just.
Well, you have a stab at that, Rob, and then I'll come in, because I think, Mike, you'll almost certainly know where I'll be coming from. So, Rob, what do you think?
Well, I think it's an interesting lens. I think Mike poses a very interesting question. Is it the case that we attract a deeper level of scrutiny, a deeper level of assessment and critique, even from within our own on occasions such as these. I mean, some of the impact of decisions that were certainly down to his office of Chancellor of the Exchequer are hard to recover from. Indeed, many would argue, Mike, that the economy is still trying to recover from it. Ironically, being led, the party anyway, the government being led by another member of the so-called ethnic minority, and the cabinet having ethnic minority members on it, and it brings to bear some of the debates that we will, I think, legitimately have about, skinfolk, kinfolk, about whether they are one of ours or not. And Dwayne puts a very powerful and a very compelling case to include Kwasi in. And I think, as I say, I think it's powerful and I think it's compelling. He is no doubt a powerhouse. He is no doubt a very intelligent man. But how could it come to be in those 38 days that he would render the pound sterling to its lowest ever level against the US dollar? How did that happen? Was that down to his acumen, or was it some outside influences, or was it the global recession that many still have not yet defined fully? There's all sorts of factors, the pandemic, all sorts of other factors. How would anyone else have fared in that place? Right back to my original point, the lens that we find ourselves, and sometimes forcing ourselves to consider, perfection as the enemy of the good. I think what it does come down to is some of the values and some of the actual politics that people stand for. And it depends on how you carry those. And I speak as someone who served inside the machine for 38 years, working up close and personal with some of these individuals, and ironically, having worked with these three. And I know what I feel, certainly in my heart, about some of them. And it doesn't detract from their milestones. It doesn't mean that they weren't able to do X, Y, and Z at all. But I do think, Mike, in answer to your question, I do think that there are some members of our community that will deliver a harsher critique of his time served. And I do think, and I say this with real thought, I do think that some of that is unfair because there are some additional factors at play here. Not all of it unfair, but some of it is unfair.
Yes, because,
I don't know how you feel about that, Dwayne.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I'll come in after Mike. What are you going to say, Mike?
I was going to say, proud, first black chancellor. Yeah, but look at what he did, and, that's how the mentality of some people are.
Don't forget, Tallahassee Coates wrote a book. We were 8 years in power. And if you speak to Cornel West or you speak to Eric Dyson at times, in the American situation, many of them will claim that Barack Obama didn't do enough in his time.
True.
And yet he puts a skip in all of our strides, doesn't he?
Well, coming back to your question about, how he is being judged, if you like. I think there was a time, and this was going back to when I was a boy, when there were very few high-profile, high achievers that we were aware of. And when any of those folks failed or fell, there was a high level of criticism all round. It wasn't deserving, you were expecting it, blah, blah, blah. However, in the 21st century, if you are looking at what's going on, there are so many from our community and from the Asian community who are making their mark, who are distinguishing themselves and also making mistakes. So we are in a generation when we're never surprised when somebody makes a mistake, because you've only got to look to your left to see another dozen, another score, another 100 like that person doing lots of wonderful things. So I think the generation that's minded to be hypercritical of any failing of a black person is receding. And I think there's a bit more objectivity. For example, Winston Churchill is one of the big heroes of this country. And there are lots of good reasons why he is so lauded. But Winston Churchill did not succeed at every turn. He had some big failures along the way. Yeah. And if you look at almost any politician out there, and, again, I'm not party political because I don't believe any of the parties are looking after my best interest. But look at the rise and fall of dear old Boris Johnson. And you can think of a lot of other MPs who have been in a similar situation. So Kwasi will have had his time when he perhaps backed the wrong horse. Let's put it that way. But if you look at his career prior to the Liz Truss situation, he backed a number of winners, and his career grew on the back of that.
Yeah.
So, hypercriticism, I think, will die a death with time, because there are just so many more like us out there contributing.
Yeah.
Well, and just to add to that, if I may, Dwayne, there are a significant number of people who would argue that the truest sign of freedom and liberty, not to take away from aspiration and wanting to be excellent and the debate around Black excellence, not to take away from any of that at all, but the truest sign of liberty and freedom is the freedom to be average and still make a living. The freedom to be who you are and make those mistakes and not be, as you put it, hypercritical, but certainly not be overly punished for it. At the end of the day, to be who you are. And as I say, that's not to detract from our aspiration to be excellent, but it doesn't have to be a prerequisite for our existence. That true liberty is to be who we are. And that is the freedom that I think.
No argument there from me, Mike. Any response on your side?
That, we need to take a long-term view on people, not just that instant moment that we see, but look overall. Like, we've taken the time to look overall at his life. We could have said, nah, we won't have him in there. What did he do?
Yeah.
That doesn't make any sense. No.
Yeah. Doesn't.
Well, hopefully we're becoming a much more discerning Windwash nation. Mm-hmm. We're not just knee-jerking from place to place, from person to person.
Absolutely. And another element of what you say, Dwayne, that I do agree with wholeheartedly, there's more than one, but another element that I agree with, he's young enough to come again.
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Okay, so moving on to the third person that we've chosen to highlight.
Our youngest person.
Chuka Umunna, also another young man.
Yeah.
And the high level description is British businessman and former politician. Now, that doesn't begin to tell the Chuka story, but those are the key things that would capture the Chuka situation. Again, chosen because he's an example of a dual heritage contributor, Nigerian father who's a businessman and a mother who's a solicitor. And, again, through his young life, lots of accolades. But let me park it there and give you guys a chance to come in. Chuka Umunna, how do we see Chuka?
It's his birthday this month as we record, Dwayne. He's I think a week away from his 45th birthday. He's 44 years old.
Still a very young man.
Very young man. And, politically, and certainly his first declared colours was, in fact, that of Liberal Democrats back in his teenage years, when as a DJ, a big lover of music, but as you mentioned earlier, he studied law. And he's also written for a number of papers across the spectrum, Dwayne.
Absolutely.
For The Voice. He's written for The Guardian. And I've worked with him on a number of fronts, including some of the work around equalities and inclusion at government offices. And I had the pleasure of interviewing him for the Black History Month magazine, about 9 years ago now, and that featured back then. What I admire about Chuka is his clarity of thought and his commitment to and his marriage to his values. Here is a man who, on the face of it, as you say, Dwayne, former politician. Some would go further and say flip-flop of a politician, because he not only did he move parties, started out as Lib Dem, eventually ran for and successfully elected as MP for Streatham under Labour, then took himself off the front benches, and in fact left the Labour Party because of a radical difference of view with the then leader, Jeremy Corbyn. And some of that I was able to speak to Chuka about privately. But what I want to share here is that here's a man, Dwayne, whose response to that was to speak with like-spirited individuals across the political spectrum and create a new party, Change UK. He created a new party. Now, I don't have to speak to the two of you about running organizations and running teams. It can be the toughest job in the world.
Absolutely.
He was trying to occupy the centralist position. He was taking with him, leading voices from both Conservative and Liberal Democrats, and with him from Labour. And they started in the February of 2019, I think it was, or was it a bit earlier? When did that party start? I think it was February 2019.
Yeah, it was very late, because it wasn't long after that he left politics altogether after the election.
Exactly. And he's on record as having said he underestimated how much it would take to not just build the vehicle, but to fuel it and to have it lift off. Let me come in at that point. Yeah.
That point for me, when we were doing the research, Mike and I, shouted he needed more mature, older heads around him to actually help him to realize that what he wanted to do was fine in principle, but it would take longer.
Yeah.
He was a young man with great ideas and in a hurry. And like a lot of young men in that condition, if you don't have a stabilizing, maturing influence around you, invariably you crash, or you give up because you realize it isn't going to happen overnight. We've got this idea of a great new party, and by Friday it's a reality and it's winning votes. It just doesn't happen that quickly. Mike?
Yeah, I was, towards the end there, I was confused, I must admit.
About what he was doing?
Yeah, he's Labour. He walked across the aisle.
Yeah.
Then he formed this party.
Yeah.
And then resigned from the party. I'm thinking, whoa, what's going on? What do you stand for? I mean, I don't know the backgrounds, but that's how it looked to me, as if, wow, he can't let go. He wants to get back in, and he's doing all he can. I was thinking, is this another David Owen and Shirley?
Shirley Williams. Shirley Williams.
Type of scenario again, But there's more to people that we don't know, but we just see what we see on the screen. So that was my impression. I'm thinking, I don't know.
You say there's more to people than we know. Mm-hmm. We saw a side of Chuka that most politicians wouldn't want you to see when he was going for the leadership election. Mm-hmm. And when the media started to turn over every stone of his life and everybody in his life, he realized that sort of scrutiny wasn't something he was enjoying or wanted. Mm. And I think I'd need verification from other sources, but I think that was when he thought, maybe I'm not that much in love with politics after all, because if it comes with all this, maybe I need to be doing something else.
Yeah. You're not far off the mark, Dwayne. You're not far off the mark at all. I think, he's 44 years old now. Some of those decisions were, as he got to his 40th, 41st, he declared his candidacy for the leadership of the Labour Party. He was certainly the BBC Newsnight's favourite, and he was certainly the BBC Question Time's favourite. He had platform, he had fuel in that part of his tank. But I think what he underestimated, Dwayne, you're absolutely right. He underestimated the amount of energy and fuel it would take to lift off as a party. With any vehicle, most of its fuel is expended on takeoff. And he underestimated that. And I think what's at the bottom of your truth there, Dwayne, is that in order to mitigate that, he needed some wiser heads around him, wiser heads who'd been around a bit longer. Not his intellect. I think that was on point. I think you look at where he is today, and we come full circle because there's another JP Morgan connection here. But,
absolutely,
he's doing all right, actually. By measures, he's doing all right. But what will be, I think, and I haven't spoken to him recently, certainly not since the pandemic. But what I think with the Chuka I know is there will be something tugging at his heart about his role in politics, and there'll be something, I think, more so than Kwasi, actually, Dwayne. I think a return of Chuka is, I think, more likely than Kwasi because of that tugging at his heart, and he's on his side as well.
Isn't that interesting? Because where I can agree with that, if Chuka settles, married, he's got a daughter, but have the children they're going to have. He now knows that he's a known entity. There's nothing else that might embarrass him or family members. In a sense, I'm saying he will get to that stage when he has the sort of conversation with his partner and family like Barack Obama did with Michelle.
Yeah.
Because Barack wouldn't have gone for the presidency without having her on board, because he knew what it was going to open the whole family up to.
Yeah.
And without that rock solid stability, it wasn't going to work. And by the way, I noticed a little bit of the Barack Obama model being applied today. Did you guys hear or see the introduction that Sunak had from his wife?
I saw every minute, every second of it. I watched.
I missed it, but my wife watched it, and that was the first thing she said to me. What a stylish wife he has!
It's through gritted teeth, Dwayne, that I have to confess that it was an impressive introduction.
There you go. Yeah. And she may well be the secret ingredient that gives him a fighting chance. I'll put my hand up now, and I could be proven wrong. Despite his best efforts, the Tories will be thrown out, not because I'm party political about it, but after 13 plus years of, I would describe as shambles, the country's ready for a change. It's not going to be down to whether Sunak is up to it or not. It's going to be the country's just thinking, we need something different. And that's why it'll be a different party. But that's a personal view.
Yes, it takes a balance, a level-headed person, a humble person, to put others first and say, I don't want to put my family through this. If that's what it's going to take, I'll step back.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Of my family. Is the country ready, gentlemen? Mike, before I go, is the country ready for an all-black party?
Go on, Rob. You can have a first stab at that.
I'll say this, Mike. I'm not sure what the motive is behind your question, but I'll answer it in this way. There's certainly enough personnel. There are enough politicians of colour capable of doing just that. There are enough people in our community, and by our community, I mean the black community, capable of doing just that. There are enough people doing work in the political arena and with the insight, the experience, dare I say, lessons learned from others who have gone before, capable of doing that without question. And I speak as someone who's worked inside the machine. I speak as someone who learns and continues to learn from people who are working in that space.
No, it was just a thought, like,
your question was,
and I thought, we would need to probably change the first past the post rule and have proportional representation.
Oh my goodness. How did you know? That's exactly what I was about to move on to.
Okay.
Because the
Mike,
first past the post is so archaic. It needs reform. It needs modernizing, because Britain is now a different shape. It's a different complexion, and it needs to reflect that. Sorry, Dwayne, over to you.
No problem. The political system that we have is the political system that we have, and that's an incredible tanker to try and turn around. So I'm not even going to touch on that, but I'm going to take a lateral view of your question, which I think is wonderfully broadening of the conversation we're having. I actually think the Windrush Nation is overdue for a political leadership class. Now, notice how I'm interpreting your word party, because the Windrush Nation is not a handful of people. It's more than 3 million. When you add all the folks of African, Caribbean, and dual heritage background together, that's the same size as Wales, the population of Wales. And I believe that if the interests and needs of the Windrush Nation are going to be addressed and well served, there needs to be a political leadership class that actually looks at those needs and actually seek to focus those needs into the sectors of our community in order that those needs are heard and addressed. And I think with that, our community, the Windrush Nation, will be better served than what your question implied. A political party that tries to speak for the whole nation, but has a mountain to climb. And Rob is right. We have lots of people in our community with the experience and the knowledge and the expertise and the desire. But you are still looking at less than 5% of the British population trying to take on the leadership for the whole thing. And that's a totally different ask altogether. But I think Windrush Nation is in desperate need of a political class that is really going to look at the 360 needs that we have and see how we can better get the attention it deserves.
All right. Well, maybe when people hear this podcast, they'll respond.
Say again?
Maybe when some folks hear the podcast, they'll chime in with their thoughts on that. But yeah.
That'd be lovely.
Yeah.
That'd be lovely.
But, you know, we normally broaden the conversation around each of the areas that we address. And I'm just willing to run through a list of people that Mike and I have researched that we might have used in this conversation, and be interesting to hear from you guys. Helen Grant was certainly in there. David Lammy was certainly in there. Diane Abbott was certainly in there. Kemi Badenoch. But there's one other person we also researched, which is Chris Wellbeloved. This is a councillor, and he's a Deputy Lord Lieutenant. And again, it brings in that whole tier of politics in this country. There are thousands, I would argue, tens of thousands of black councillors across the United Kingdom. When you look at the great many in Greater London and beyond. So, you know, there are lots to be proud of in terms of the political arena, and our community have certainly made its mark, and I guess will continue to make its mark.
Yes.
Absolutely.
Well, Rob and Dwayne, I got to ask the question, you know, any connections? Dwayne Neal, Rob Neal, any connections?
I know for certain there's no connection, but if Rob knows better, now is a good time for him to talk.
I'm going to keep that a secret.
All right, fair enough.
To be revealed on a future episode.
Yes, you're a true not politician, but you know, civil servant. You know, you hear everything, but you know nothing.
I'm going away to form a focus group to look at that, Mike.
There are lots of people out there who can help to answer that question, I'm sure. But you know,
Dwayne, do you know you're the same age as Baroness Scotland?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. She's, I think, 56 born, and I'm 55. Or thereabout. Yeah. But next episode, we'll be looking at folks in the voluntary and community sector. And that should bring in some very interesting contributors.
Wonderful.
Right.
Wonderful.
Right.
Mike, Rob, wonderful as always.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
All right. Look forward to the next episode. Take care.
And you.
Take care, everyone.
Stay well. Stay well.
Bye.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Stay strong.